he's lost obviously an enormous amount of weight since he was detained as well, and had an array of different health challenges. So, the charges against Ruben and the others, are politically motivated. And when you look at now the more than 40 charges that Ruben is facing, that Aliyev and his regime vilified, demonized, and disenfranchised anyone of any Armenian descent. We do need the Armenian people to continue to speak up and speak out. It's actually often much worse for the families than it is for the prisoners themselves, because the families don't know what's happening on a moment-to-moment basis.
Our guest today is Genser, a leading international human rights lawyer and the legal representative of former State Minister of Nagorno-Karabakh, Ruben Vardanyan, who has been imprisoned in Baku since 2023. Mr. Genser has a long track record of defending political prisoners around the world, including Nobel Peace Prize laureates. Hello and welcome, Mr. Genser. Thank you for this interview.
Thanks for having me.
Mr. Genser, former State Minister of Artsakh, Ruben Bartyam, is facing over 40 charges and potential life sentence. His trials, and not only his trials, but the trials of all Armenian detainees in Baku, are being held behind closed doors, without access for international journalists, observers, human rights organizations, and so on. So nobody knows what's really going on there in Baku. What can you tell us? What kind of real risks are Ruben Vardanyan facing right now, not only legally but also physically? And what's the latest news about his health after 2 hunger strikes and conditions in prison?
Well, I would start with the conditions in prison, which are terrible, not just for him, but for really all of the Armenian prisoners. This is very, very well known, and he's lost obviously an enormous amount of weight since he was detained as well, and had an array of different health challenges. I think we're especially concerned that the International Committee of the Red Cross is now no longer able to access him and the others. They had been an independent source that was able to communicate with him and express concerns about the prison conditions to the Azeri authorities. And the lack of independent monitors is obviously something that is of enormous concern. Ruben and the others, for example, can't even have Bibles.
They took it from him because he used to have something in his hands. We were watching some parts of it. He was reading something there.
Yeah, in the trial itself,
yes.
But he can't access this in the prison system, even though, of course, he should have every right to be able to do that. As his international lawyer, I actually haven't been able to access him or have a single conversation with him, which, of course, violates international law. But I think that the bottom line is that if you look at the case against Ruben and the other former officials of Artsakh, the charges are obviously politically motivated and have really nothing to do with anything other than the fact that they're, demonstrating, their right to freedom of opinion expression, peaceful assembly, peaceful association, their right to self-determination of peoples, by obviously having run the Nagorno-Karabakh government. And Aliyev quite clearly was looking to expel the 200,000 people, the Armenian Christian population, through an ethnic cleansing, and this was kind of the beginning of the campaign. He also, of course, went after a lot of the former leaders like Ruben, forced the government to dismantle itself, right, so that it no longer exists, right, and this is all part of a very long-standing plan that he had for many years said he intended to undertake. So the charges against Ruben and the others, are politically motivated, and when you look at now the more than 40 charges that Ruben is facing, they're for crimes that alleged crimes that he literally had nothing to do with in any way whatsoever, and even the witnesses at the so-called trial, are not suggesting that he was involved in any way either, which is why it's kind of all the more ridiculous. The case is being heard before a military tribunal. Under international law, a civilian should not be tried before a military tribunal. In fact, it's illegal under international law, and that's because a military judges and prosecutors are not independent and impartial, right? They report to the commander-in-chief, which in this case is, of course, President Aliyev. So the outcome is predetermined. Ultimately, Ruben will be convicted, the others will be convicted, and the question is ultimately really much more of a political and public relations question, which is how do we get them out of there, and how do you get political prisoners being detained by dictators out of jail?
So we will come to political issues, but I would like to know also, you said that you hadn't have any direct connection with Ruben Vardanyan, but did you have some indirect relationship connection with him, and if so, what has he conveyed about his hopes?
Well, look, I think when I was hired by his family, the message that I got from him through his family, was to not just advocate for him, but to advocate for all of the Armenian prisoners and POWs, right? I mean, this is not about him. He, of course, is symbolic of what is happening, obviously, in the relationship between Armenia and Azerbaijan, in the situation with Artsakh, and more generally with what happened, obviously, to the people of Artsakh with the ethnic cleansing. But his is just one of a number of different cases. And so what we've done really everywhere we've gone and all the places that we've been advocating is to use his case as an example, but to really talk about, in every case, all of the prisoners needing to be released.
So recently, the Vardanyan's lawyer in Baku has issued a statement expressing his concerns about some issues, legal issues. Can you simplify for us what kind of issues, what kind of concerns were he speaking about?
Yeah, I mean, look, even under the the Azerbaijan constitution, you have the right to the presumption of innocence. You have a right to access to counsel, international and domestic. You have a right to an open trial and a right to be able to, to challenge witnesses against you, and a right to know the charges against you, right, and to be able to understand them in a language that you speak and so forth. These are all areas where there have been flagrant violations of Ruben's rights. The tribunal itself has, the panel of judges, of military judges, have made very, very clear from the outset that there's going to be no justice in this courtroom, not only by barring outside observers, but you've now had 150, 200 so-called witnesses that have been brought by the prosecution to present so-called evidence, right? These are all people who assert that they were injured in some kind of confrontation between Armenian forces and Azerbaijani forces or people in Azerbaijan, right? Not a single one of them has any evidence that, none of them have, about this case actually at all, right? None of them have met Ruben, they've never seen him, they've never had any contact with him of any kind, and they have no evidence, none of them present any evidence that he had anything to do with the injuries that they allegedly suffered, right? And so, ordinarily such evidence would be dismissed out of hand by any judge as hearsay evidence, meaning that, you can't just assert you heard from a third party somebody did something. You need a witness to say, I saw Ruben order this, or here's the email that I got, or these kinds of things. And so this is all indirect evidence that in any ordinary proceeding would have been immediately disallowed entirely. And that's been the bulk of the 20 plus hearings that we've now had, or these so-called witnesses. So I mean, the whole thing makes no sense at all. So
coming to this question then, do you see the arrest of Ruben Bardanyan and other Armenian high-rank officials of Nagorno-Karabakh as an attempt to criminalize Armenia's self-determination process, or maybe rewrite the narrative of Armenia-Azerbaijani conflict?
Well, I think it was part and parcel of the overall plan that Aliyev executed that included the ethnic cleansing, the dismantling of the Nagorno-Karabakh government, and the imprisoning of the top officials. Ruben and the others who were detained are those who have been most outspoken, public, and credible in engaging with the international community and talking about the rights of self-determination of the people of Artsakh, right? And so by grabbing them and imprisoning them all and putting these bogus charges against them, right? You've been able to, silence the leaders of the people of Artsakh who themselves were victims of an ethnic cleansing. And so I think that this was very much part of the overall strategy. But at the end of the day, the international community knows exactly what's going on here. And, I don't quite know what Aliyev thinks he's accomplishing by having this military tribunal with, this parade of witnesses who have no evidence Ruben did anything wrong, right? They're not going to prove anything to anybody who objectively looks at the situation. On the face of it, it's, a flagrant violation of international law.
So you have appealed to international community, the United States, United Nations, and others. Has there any concrete response? Are these calls being held?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously there's only so much I can say publicly and on the air. But what I can say is that, there's a very different approach in Washington under President Trump as compared to under President Biden. President Biden was really trying to facilitate a peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and the position that we heard from the Biden administration was, in essence, if neither side wants to talk about it, we're not going to put the issue on the agenda. President Trump has taken a very different approach, and what he said is he wants a peace deal done, and he expects that the Armenian prisoners will be released either before or at the same time of that kind of an agreement. And that's been conveyed privately, as I understand it, directly to Aliyev. It's also been talked about publicly. If you look at the former National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, having had a conversation with the National Security Advisor of Azerbaijan and having conveyed that they discussed the issue of the prisoners, and having had a series of meetings with senior White House officials, I am absolutely convinced that this is a top priority for the administration, and there are a lot of things being put together that will make very, very clear to Aliyev that if he doesn't ultimately sign the peace agreement as it currently stands, and if he continues to delay, that there will be consequences coming from Washington that will be significant. Frankly, Aliyev also wants a lot of things from Washington. I mean, I'm sure he'd like to see President Trump in the Oval Office. He'd like to see a lifting of the sanctions, right? And my understanding is that the message that's been conveyed is you're going to get nothing unless you sign a deal and unless you release the prisoners. So I think that's a very different set of messages that are being sent. President Trump himself, when he was running for president again, put out a True Social post where he specifically and publicly said that what happened in Artsakh was an ethnic cleansing, and he said that if he's elected president again, which of course he was, that he would stand up for persecuted Christians. So Christians and evangelical Christians are a very large part of President Trump's political base in the United States, and we've been really, really pleased to have some strong support from evangelical Christian leaders who also are strong Republicans, who have been outspoken and in support of of the Armenian Christian prisoners and conveying those critical messages to the president and his senior leadership team. I'd lastly note that Secretary Rubio, who's now acting also National Security Advisor, also has a long history as a U.S. Senator in caring deeply about political prisoner cases. His father was a political prisoner, his grandfather was a political prisoner in Cuba. And on the issue of Artsakh, in the Senate, he was very, very outspoken on the Armenian side of that issue. He's been, very straightforward in condemning Aliyev's imprisonment of political prisoners across the board. It's worth noting he has 350 of his own political prisoners, not just the Armenian Christian prisoners, right? And so, I think that, President Trump has made very clear what he'd like to see happen, and Secretary Rubio is undoubtedly going to play a key role, I think, in making sure that this process moves forward and that it can't be further delayed.
So there is still hope.
There is, I feel honestly more hope now than I felt in a long time, because I see, both in the public messaging and also from what I'm aware of behind the scenes, that there is very clear movement going forward in a wide array of ways. And Aliyev understands very clearly what he needs to do, and he understands that there will be consequences if he doesn't move this process forward.
So maybe coming to one of the most important questions. How would you assess the Armenian government's actions so far? Are they doing enough, or are they doing anything to push for Ruben Vardanyan's and other detainees' release? Well,
in the past I've been quite open and critical about the lack of effort that we've seen publicly in terms of what the government of Armenia has been doing, and I expressed a range of ideas to Prime Minister Pashinyan about how he could be more publicly engaged. I obviously was concerned to see the most recent comments by the foreign minister that there are no discussions underway about the situation of the prisoners. But that isn't the end of the story. It's important to emphasize because I know that the Trump White House is in fact directly engaging with Aliyev on these questions as well. So it isn't just up to Armenia. I think it's very, very important to appreciate and to emphasize for Prime Minister Pashinyan that clearly he's where he needs to be. He's going to sign the peace agreement. But once that peace agreement is signed, my understanding is it includes a provision in it that says both sides will withdraw all claims at international courts and will no longer be able to raise those issues. And so what that means is that if the prisoners are not released before at the same time as a deal, right, then he won't even be able to raise the issue of the prisoners going forward, right? And what that means is that they will be trapped in Azerbaijan with Aliyev being able to do what he wants. And so, I do know that a number of people that have met Pashinyan in the last, let's say, 6 months, who have made it clear to him that President Trump has a very different position on these issues than President Biden did, that it's a really important priority. It's an important priority for the evangelical Christian base of the president as well. And these are the kinds of messages that I understand that senior Trump administration officials have been conveying to Pashinyan as well. So, at the end of the day, ultimately, it's not likely going to be a deal between, Armenia and Azerbaijan alone on the prisoners. The United States is going to play a key role here. And I think that President Trump sees, and we saw this when Steve Witkoff went to meet Aliyev in Baku, President Trump sees that there's the possibility of reaching a deal, and he understands that the prisoners must be a part of that process before at the same time. And so I think at this point it's sort of much wider and larger than just Pashinyan himself and what he might do. But clearly, for him to encourage, President Trump to make sure that the prisoners are all released, I think it's something that he should be doing both publicly and privately.
So now you're in Armenia for another event, as far as I know. You will tell a little bit about it, please. And can you use this opportunity or just do something to have some meetings with the representatives of Armenian government, why not with Nikol Pashinyan, and tell him or tell them all that you have told right now me?
I think it's fair to say that the Armenian government knows my views, and they've been conveyed quite clearly. I obviously can't speak publicly about. I can't speak publicly about exactly what I'm doing here in full. But I think that the government knows my views quite clearly. The reality is, as I said, this is not just the U.S. now playing a facilitating role with a hands-off approach, right? This is the U.S. leaning in and saying to both sides, we need the Armenian Christian prisoners freed. So I think we're in a very different situation than we were during the Biden administration. And the reality is that we do need the Armenian people to continue to speak up and speak out. I understand that this is not a top of mind issue. We're obviously way past the 2020 war, and daily concerns of average Armenians are not really focused on Artsakh or the plight of these prisoners. But it is important that the Prime Minister continue to hear from people in the public at large that the expectation is that when a peace deal is signed, that at the same time or before, the Armenian prisoners have to come home. And I think that that's an important message for people here to be sending directly to him.
So, Mr. Genser, many Armenians feel really helpless watching all this. What would you say to them, to us? What just an ordinary person can do to help?
I think the most important thing is to speak out publicly, to use social media to talk about and highlight what's happening with the prisoners, to reach out to your parliamentarians, to civil society groups, to the media, to talk about what's going on. I think that the more that there's a focus on telling their stories and talking about why average Armenians, should be caring about these issues, even if they took place a distance away from here, I think is really, really important. At the end of the day, for the prisoners and their families, they're living, in hell on a daily basis. It's actually often much worse for the families than it is for the prisoners themselves, because the families don't know what's happening on a moment-to-moment basis. And the families wake up every day worrying about their loved ones, going to sleep at night, worrying about their loved ones, and having no idea, because this is not a legal process, this is a political process, what tomorrow is going to bring. But the reality is that, the families can't give up, and the families desperately need the help and the support, not only of the people of Armenia, but of its government, to ensure that they can be brought home as soon as possible.
And coming to the end of our conversation, what would justice look like in this case? Not only for Ruben Vardanyan, but for all displaced people, Artsakhi people, imprisoned people in Baku.
Yeah, well, that's a much more complicated and long-term problem, obviously, to address. As a matter of international law, the people of Artsakh should be able to return to their homes, and if that proves to be impossible, then they should be compensated for their losses, which are obviously substantial. Ultimately, in the near term, this is not something that's going to be achievable, but that doesn't mean that that's not something that one should give up on either. I think that the best case scenario really is for the political prisoners and the POWs to be able to ultimately come home as part of a peace deal, as I said, at or before, and and then they can then continue that fight as well. The leaders of Artsakh who would come home for justice and accountability for the people of Artsakh itself. But the struggle to advance human rights and democracy is a very long one, and there'll be enormous challenges ahead. But I think the most important thing to say is that any peace agreement that is signed really has to be, if it's going to be sustainable, address the full range of issues in the bilateral relationship. If major issues are not addressed as part of this process, then the dream of the Armenian people to live in peace with their neighbors and to not ever face artillery barrages and other attacks won't be fully realized. And so this has to not just be a peace agreement that is signed, that it's on a piece of paper. It actually has to be a sustainable peace where over time there can be peace not only between the governments but between the peoples of both countries. And that's obviously very, very difficult when you look at Aliyev and his regime and, you know, the extraordinary ways in which he has vilified, demonized, and, you know, disenfranchised anyone of any Armenian descent. And the way that he speaks about Armenian peoples, of course, you know, mirrors the kind of language you see, you know, in the advance of atrocity crimes being committed, genocide, crimes against humanity, and so forth. And so there's going to be a very, very long way, you know, from here, even if a peace agreement is achieved, to move from a, you know, from a cold peace to ideally a warm peace. A lot of that is going to depend on the Azeri people themselves, right? I mean, he has more than 350 political prisoners that he's detaining, you know, in Baku, and if the people of Azerbaijan are able to restore democracy and human rights to their own country, then there may be a very different path forward in terms of the relationship between the governments of Azerbaijan and Armenia and between the peoples of both countries. Right now, that would appear to be a very distant dream.
Thank you for the interview, Mr. Genser.
My pleasure.
Our guest today was Jared Genser, the legal representative of former State Minister of Nagorno-Karabakh, Ruben Vardanyan, who has been imprisoned in Baku since 2023.